Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I am Munib Hamid with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the headlines first. In New Zealand, a far-right terrorist who martyred 51 worshippers in 2 Christchurch mosques has been sentenced to life in prison without parole. Brenton Tarrant is the first person in the country's history to get the sentence. Earlier, Tarrant pleaded guilty to the murder of 51 people, attempted murder of another 40, and 1 charge of terrorism. "75 people have been killed in an overnight attack by Boko Haram militants in Nigeria's northeastern town of Gwoza. A government official said the militants targeted the town's elderly people in the attack. More than 50,000 civilians and security personnel have been killed by Boko Haram terrorists in over a decade. The US says scores of its soldiers were injured in northwestern Syria after Russian military patrol slammed into their vehicle. In a statement, a White House spokesperson said US troops suffered concussive symptoms following the incident. The coronavirus has infected over 24 million people, claiming more than 825,000 lives across the globe. India has recorded its highest ever daily cases with over 75,000 infections, while the death toll has exceeded 60,000 mark with 1,023 fatalities. In Pakistan, the death rate continues to decline as 6 people died in the past 24 hours, taking the tally to 6,274 with over 294,000 infections. News coming in detail after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now let's have the news in detail. We begin from New Zealand, where a far-right terrorist who martyred 51 worshippers in 2 Christchurch mosques has been sentenced to life in prison without parole. Brenton Tarrant is the first person in the country's history to get this sentence. The court announced the sentence after 3 days of hearings that began earlier this week. Tarrant represented himself at the hearings and refused the right to address the court. Speaking to the media, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern expressed solidarity with the Muslim community in the country.
This has been a crime in New Zealand that the likes of which has never occurred before. And now we've seen a sentence the likes of which we've never seen before as well. But yes, it gave me relief to know that that person will never see the light of day.
Earlier, Tarrant pleaded guilty to the murder of 51 people, attempted murder of another 40, and 1 charge of terrorism. Now moving on, 75 people have been killed in an overnight attack by Boko Haram militants in Nigeria's northeastern town of Gwoza. A government official said the militants targeted the town's elderly people in the attack. He said people continue to die every day despite security forces are doing their utmost in the region. The official said the people of the region are facing extreme hunger and the situation will worsen if there is no aid for them. More than 50,000 civilians and security personnel have been killed by Boko Haram terrorists in over a decade. Now, Pakistan has rejected the so-called charge sheet by India, attempting to implicate the country in the last year's Pulwama attack in occupied Kashmir. In a statement, the Foreign Office said the charge sheet is designed to further New Delhi's anti-Pakistan rhetoric and narrow political gains. Soon after the attack, Pakistan expressed its readiness to extend cooperation with India on the basis of any actionable information. But India failed to provide credible evidence and has been using the attack for its malicious propaganda against Pakistan since then. The Foreign Office said India cannot mislead the world community. It said New Delhi's allegations against Islamabad seek to divert attention from India's state terrorism in occupied Kashmir. Meanwhile, the US says scores of its soldiers were injured in northwestern Syria after a Russian military patrol slammed into their vehicle. In a statement, a White House spokesperson said U.S. troops suffered concussive symptoms following the incident. The spokesperson said unprofessional actions breach the confliction protocols that the U.S. and Russia are committed to. He said the coalition and the U.S. do not seek escalation with any military forces. But he said the U.S. forces retain the inherent right and obligation to defend themselves from hostile acts. Meanwhile, Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov said U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff has discussed the matter with Chief of Russia's General Staff. The U.S. and Russia have military presence in Syria to maintain peace. Now, the U.S. has accused China of repeatedly falling short of promises to abide by the international laws, saying Beijing wants to project its power globally. Speaking in Hawaii, U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper said Washington needs to be able to deal with China and Russia in all parts of the world. Esper said Beijing is working towards establishing a world-class military by the middle of the century to advance its Communist Party's agenda. The U.S. defense chief said Washington is open to working with Beijing to align it with the international rules-based order. The bilateral ties have worsened this year over a range of issues, including the coronavirus, South China Sea, Hong Kong, telecom, and global trade. Protests in the U.S. city of Kenosha in Wisconsin state continues for the fourth night following the shooting of Jacob Blake by a police officer. Demonstrators defied the 2-hour night curfew to hit the streets in eastern Kenosha County. Violence has occurred throughout the last 3 nights, with buildings set on fire and 2 people killed yesterday. Court officials say a teenager identified as Kyle Rittenhouse has been arrested and charged with homicide. The lakeside city has been rocked by civil unrest, to which President Donald Trump says he is sending federal forces to restore order. In a tweet, Trump said the nation will not stand for looting, arson, violence, and lawlessness on American streets. But local media says National Guards are not present in the city's east side where the protesters have gathered. Meanwhile, Wisconsin's Attorney General Josh Kaul has named the officer who shot Blake. Talking to media, Kaul said officers found a knife in Blake's car, but no other weapons. The Department of Justice has sent over 200 FBI agents and U.S. Marshals to the city as it opens federal investigation into the shooting. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence has promised to preserve law and order and economic viability on the third night of the Republican National Convention in Baltimore. Pence warned the Americans against electing Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden. Pence said contrary to Biden's assertions, economic recovery and law and order were on the ballot, not democracy. He said Biden will do the bidding of the radical left and that the American identity was on the line in the elections. The vice president also slammed Biden over his proposal to reduce funding for the law enforcement, saying Biden's America will not be a safe place. He said U.S. President Donald Trump will always side with the police against the rioters in Minneapolis, Portland, Kenosha, or anywhere else.
The violence must stop, whether in Minneapolis, Portland, or Kenosha. Too many heroes have died defending our freedom to see Americans strike each other down. We will have law and order on the streets of this country for every American of every race and creed and color.
President Trump will address the convention on the fourth and final night of the Republican convention. Now, moving on, Turkey says it's not creating instability in the Eastern Mediterranean. In a statement, Turkish Communications Directorate said President Tayyip Erdogan made these remarks in a phone call with U.S. counterpart Donald Trump. The statement said the two leaders discussed bilateral and regional developments, particularly the Mediterranean. It said the Erdogan stressed that Turkey provide with concrete actions that it wants to reduce tensions and establish a dialogue on the matter. Meanwhile, Trump has also discussed the matter with Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis in a separate phone call. The White House said Trump expressed concerns about rising regional tensions. Trump also urged both NATO allies to resolve the dispute through dialogue. West African mediators have told Mali's military coup leaders to form a transitional government for a maximum of 12 months. In a statement, Nigeria's presidency said the transitional government must be led by a civilian or a retired military officer. It said the interim government will need to hold elections to restore full constitutional order. This comes after a meeting between Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari and the head of a delegation from the regional bloc. Meanwhile, the EU has temporarily suspended its training missions in Mali following the coup that ousted President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. EU officials said the mission were meant for training Mali's army and police to stabilize the country. Meanwhile, the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, has called for a deal with Britain on future ties by the end of October. Speaking in Paris, Barnier said a deal must be reached to ensure ratification of a new treaty. The EU negotiator said if conditions allow, he can meet his British counterpart next week. Talks between London and Brussels over post-Brexit ties have made little progress, with both sides blaming each other for the stalemate. The post-Brexit transition period is expiring on the 31st of December. Now, Human Rights Watch says Lebanese security forces used excessive force against anti-government protesters after the Beirut port explosion. In a statement, the international rights body has called for an investigation into the abuses. The explosion fueled outrage at the political class already blamed for an economic meltdown. In demonstrations 4 days after the blast, some protesters stormed government ministries and hurled stones at security forces. The rights group said security forces had fired live ammunition, metal pellets and projectiles such as rubber balls at the health workers. It said police deployed excessive quantities of tear gas and security forces threw stones at protesters and beat them. It said such unlawful force against mostly peaceful protesters show the callous disregard of the authorities for their own people. The toll from floods triggered by torrential rains in Afghanistan's 12 eastern provinces has risen to 122. The Ministry of Disaster Management said 147 people were injured and many others were missing since Tuesday night. The latest casualties come from Kapisa and Panjshir provinces. The ministry data said 1,500 houses and more than 1,000 hectares of agricultural land were destroyed in the floods. A ministry official said search and rescue missions are underway in the flood-hit areas. A spokesman for President Ashraf Ghani said authorities have been instructed to provide emergency disaster relief to the survivors. Business news coming up after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now moving on with the news stories. The new coronavirus has infected over 24 million people, claiming more than 825,000 lives across the globe. India has recorded its highest ever daily cases with over 75,000 infections, increasing the tally to over 3.3 million. Details in this report.
As the Americas continue to struggle with COVID-19, the virus has also tightened its grip over India, the country of over 1 billion people. While the country breaks the record of new cases every other day, India's death toll has exceeded the 60,000 mark with 1,023 fatalities overnight. In Latin America, Argentina has registered a record daily rise of more than 10,000 infections, while in Peru, healthcare employees protest over working conditions as the country's infection tally crossed 600,000. The U.S. state of California has announced to test 250,000 people for the virus every day.
California is committing to a diagnostic testing partnership that will provide an additional 150,000 tests per day. So we're averaging over 100,000 tests a day. We were doing well north of 130,000 before the wildfires. We'll get back up into that range very shortly. This is additive. It's not a substitute.
In Europe, Ukraine has banned most foreigners until September 28th and extended lockdown measures until the end of October. Germany has banned protests against coronavirus curbs as organizers failed to ensure protective measures would be observed. Whereas despite reporting a new post-lockdown high with cases topping 5,000, France prepares to restart school with mandatory masks.
What everyone must understand in a clear and simple way is that all adults must wear a mask, and children as teenagers must wear it from the first year of the middle school. It is true that in July-August, we thought to set up some exceptions as for assistance in preschool class, or when social distancing was respected for some activities, but we have chosen not to keep those exceptions in order to make the rules clear for everyone.
In Australia, the second most populous state of Victoria has reported its lowest number of daily cases in 2 months, as 113 tested positive overnight. Mainland China recorded only 8 new imported cases and no domestic transmissions. South Korea has recorded over 440 cases overnight, its highest number of daily infections since March.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, the number of active COVID-19 cases continue to fall under the 9,000 mark. The Health Ministry said the recovery rate from the disease is over 94%. The ministry said 445 new cases were reported across the country overnight, taking the toll to over 294,000. It said 6 more people died in the past 24 hours. The nationwide death toll stands at 6,274. Sindh remains the worst hit province, witnessing nearly 129,000 infections, while Punjab has reported over 96,000 cases so far. Well, now Asian markets are trading mixed as the latest data shows the economic recovery of China. Beijing's industrial sector has grown 19.6% from last year, an overall increase of 11.5% since June. Stocks in mainland China rise as the Shanghai Composite surges by 0.25%, while the Shenzhen Composite increases by almost 1%. Over in Hong Kong, the Hang Seng Index falls by more than 0.5%. Japan's Nikkei 225 shed almost 0.5%. South Korea's Kospi falls by more than 0.5%. Australia's ASX 200 increased marginally. International benchmark Brent crude futures have risen to above $46 a barrel for the first time since March. The World Economic Forum says its yearly meeting in Davos has been postponed to the summer of next year. In a statement, the forum spokesman Adrian Monk said the decision was taken following advice from health experts amid the pandemic. Monk said it was not an easy decision since the need for leaders to come together to design the Great Reset in post-pandemic era is so urgent. He said in lieu of the meeting, the forum will host virtual high-level discussions the week of January 25. The announcement came the same day Swiss authorities recorded 383 COVID-19 infections in the last 24 hours. With this, we come to the end of this bulletin. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Take care.